I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. I'm delighted to welcome to our broadcast today Professor Carl Bergstrom, biologist at the University of Washington. Welcome to the program today.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Great to be here.
You are author of the new book, Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. I am eager to discuss this book with you and the scholarship on bullshit. Harry Frankfurt, of course, wrote a little volume on that subject, and you are really importantly exposing it in an age of viral deception, disinformation, and misinformation. What prompted you to write the book? Is it what is obvious in front of us, the manipulation of fact?
It's part of that. You know, it's I think the way that my colleague Jevin West, the co-author on the book, and I had seen information, particularly quantitative information, being misused to try to confuse people. So, you know, Frankfurt's original essay was written, I think, in '86. It's really focusing on, sort of qualitative verbal BS. And, you know, as we've come into a world where data is so important in decision-making and presented so centrally in the public sphere, but we felt like it needed an update to help people take on data that was sort of being presented, you know, misinformation, disinformation, BS being presented in the form of statistics or facts and figures, data graphics, that kind of thing.
So I'm going to use malarkey as our BS for the purposes of this conversation. And also because one of our leading presidential candidates loves to employ that word, malarkey. So malarkey is not new to American political life, but there has been a vast anti-intellectual, anti-science campaign in this country. We're living through the gravest health crisis, not just of our lifetimes, Professor, but possibly of the entire American experience. And there's no doubt that there's the most malarkey emanating from America and maybe some of the other nations that are most plagued by the pandemic, namely Brazil, an anti-science campaign there. So there is a uniqueness to your subject matter. How can the book be constructive in the way we view the malarkey around the pandemic?
I think what the book tries to do is to show every single reader that you don't need to have a degree in statistics or epidemiology or computer science or mathematics or anything else to be able to see through numerical misinformation. You just have to be able to think clearly about the way that people are analyzing the kinds of data that they're presenting to you. So to give you an example, you know, we talk in the book a lot about selection bias, and this is the notion that that people take a statistical sample that might be convenient to collect, but doesn't actually represent the population that they're trying to study. And we saw this with the coronavirus pandemic. There are these couple of doctors in Bakersfield who tested the patients coming into their clinic, and they said, oh wow, you know, like an awful lot of the patients coming into our clinic have COVID, and therefore we're going to extrapolate that to everyone in California and conclude that COVID is extremely prevalent throughout California. You don't need a degree in statistics to see that these guys screwed up. The people that go into a clinic during the middle of a pandemic are far more likely to be infected with the disease than the population at large.
What about the problem of disrespect for expertise?
This is a challenge. I think there's sort of an ongoing, you know, as you mentioned, campaign to undermine the authority of people in positions of expertise, because often the information that they provide is politically inconvenient, and that's a substantial problem if one's trying to say that, you know, this pandemic isn't going to be a big deal, it's no worse than flu, it's going to go away, it's going to magically disappear on April 1st, and you have a bunch of epidemiologists who've spent their lives working on this at the CDC saying, well, wait a minute, no, that's not right. You know, you can either correct course, or you can try to, discredit the people that are presenting this information.
Do you take the short or long-term view of bullshit? Do you take the view that it is a means to an end, and that end is ultimately, you know, salvaging civil society, or do you view it as the corrupting force against civil society right now?
Well, I think more the latter. I think that, you know, there's a difference between BS and lying as well. So, you know, BS, often people don't even really care about the particular facts that they're trying to present to you. They're just trying to persuade you, impress you, that kind of thing, as opposed to leading you away from some particular truth. So I think we're seeing this mix of BS and lying in this case, where where we actually get sort of active, lying campaigns where where people are trying to provide misinformation about or disinformation about the prevalence of disease in the United States, or the likely future trajectory. And then you have this, whereas a lot of what the book is looking at is sort of the sort of passive misinformation of the sort where people don't care what you believe. They're just trying to make you think they're authorities. They're trying to seem official, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, you use the word passive. I think the idea to some is that malarkey or BS is more of a passive, or maybe even in some cases unintentional. It's not the kind of malicious lying that you see in public discourse. But how much of what you're writing about is intended to deceive? The difference between disinformation, which a demagogue would want to incite the population, or in project lies, and is intentionally misinforming people. How much of the malarkey is in that vein of disinformation versus error in misinformation?
Yeah, I think in the book, an awful lot of it is sort of error and misinformation. We spend a lot of time talking about the way that well-meaning researchers in science can come up with conclusions that collectively can be misleading. So we talk a lot about this problem of publication bias in science, where because positive results are exciting, negative results are boring, people tend to publish almost exclusively positive results. And so if something doesn't work, you might not see the papers saying that it doesn't work. You'll just see the one where it kind of appeared by mistake to work. So I think, in the book, we're really focusing a lot on the sorts of accidental misinformation that are out there and how to avoid being deceived by that. We don't draw a really sharp distinction in terms of the motive, the way that Harry Frankfurt did. So for Harry Frankfurt, malarkey is in the mind of the malarkeyer, and for us, we're following G.A. Cohen and some of the other philosophers who've written about this, and we see malarkey more in the mind of the receiver.
Right.
So it almost doesn't matter what the intent was. It's like, can you see through it or not?
I mean, you as a biologist and a scientist are the person we most want to hear about malarkey, because we're in the midst of this pandemic. And what you draw attention to in the book are some practices that could really misinform the response to a vaccine, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think that what is very, very important for people to be aware of is that when presenting quantitative information, there are tricks that people can use to make a story feel one way, even if the numbers lean in the other direction. And so we really stress things like it's very, very important to make fair comparisons when you're looking at quantitative information. To pick an example from back before the pandemic, there was this study that was widely reported about how the airport security trays were much germier than the airport toilets. And that made it on the news headlines everywhere. And it was a pretty disgusting thought. But if you actually look at what the study did, the study swabbed both toilet seats and airport trays for the presence of respiratory viruses, and only respiratory viruses. And so people aren't sneezing on toilet seats for the most part. And so this really wasn't a fair comparison. Of course, there were a ton of germs on toilet seats.
Fecal,
Right, but they weren't sampling for that. And so I mean, the whole thing is like, just to this is another one where you don't have to know any of the statistics. You don't have to, be an expert. You just have to ask, like, okay, what are they sampling? Is this actually a fair comparison between A and B? And I think, coming at the whole book is really about empowering our audience to recognize that they can be informed and critical consumers of scientific and quantitative information in the popular press and beyond, and by asking fairly straightforward, simple questions, and by learning various rules of thumb about how to actually make sense of the media landscape that we're in, where we're getting all kinds of sources of information flowing across social media and everything else, and sort of the importance of looking at where information is coming from. If something seems too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. The importance of sort of tracking back to the source, triangulating, everything a good reporter would do.
Right.
And so then the challenge is, well, none of us have the time to be a good reporter in our sort of daily media consumption. And so how can you build up a set of habits of mind that give you an effective BS detector?
Right. So in that detector, we have to consider the fact that skepticism, not just malarkey, is in the eye of the beholder, but skepticism too is. And so you have this wave, and I think that the QAnon and anti-vax movements, they may be more than waves of, I don't think we should use the word skepticism. What is the appropriate way to delineate that?
Yeah, this is super important. I mean, I think that there's skepticism, and then there's sort of, conspiracy theorizing, right? And so, with skepticism, one wants to one wants to make sure that the data are coming from legitimate perspective. One wants to understand about a data source. Who's telling me this? How do they know it? What are they trying to sell me? But then one, as one tries to create, your own view of the world, you then, if you're taking a skeptical perspective or a scientific perspective, then you turn those same tools on your own hypotheses and your own theories about how things are going on, and you're just as skeptical of your own explanations for things as you would be of anyone else's. And this notion of like, Neil Postman stresses this, and he says, he calls it Postman's second law of BS, is that the BS you have to be the most concerned about is that coming from yourself. And so I feel like with some of these conspiracy theory movements, people, it's almost this game of stringing together these really wild theories that then don't get subjected to the same level of, critical questioning.
Have you studied how many people are self-aware or introspective about the fact that they are spewing BS? How many of us know that we're conscious of the fact that we are engaged in that?
So I haven't personally studied this. My strong sense is that we all there are times when we all do it and know we're doing it. Whether that's, just kind of telling stories with people or making excuses or whatever, those of us who are still in school, you're writing an essay on a book you haven't read or whatever the case may be. And then I think that there is this level to which we all can improve our ability to question our own explanations for things. And as a scientist, this is so important, that when you are studying some particular problem and the data seem to all fall into place beautifully, and now you've got a lovely explanation and you're thinking, wow, this is going to be a marvelous paper. You have to sit down and try as hard as you can to break that, to try as hard to break that as you would of, some claim that completely countered all of your beliefs and intuitions. Right. And that's what we were trying to teach in the book, because
there's a different level of BS from the gang leader of a Facebook page that is spewing disinformation or bullying with disinformation, and Mark Zuckerberg, who is profiting off of disinformation and misinformation. So there are different levels of malarkey there, and societally they're different. Again, I don't know if BS is the right way to characterize it, but what's going on at the corporate level in preserving a system that is capitalizing and exploiting the malarkey versus sort of the malarkey in day-to-day interactions. Yeah. They work in conjunction, but who's most guilty of spreading it? And that would be the people who are actually amplifying it, or the infrastructure for amplifying it.
Well, this is a really important observation, and we talk a fair bit in the book about this, is that the way that we get our information has changed radically in the last 20 years. And every time there's been a big change in the way that information is distributed in sort of human history, there are big changes in the nature of information that gets shared as well. And of course, our big change most recently is this transition to linking up all the computers in the world, allowing everybody to be a content producer with digital typesetting and web typography and all of that, and then the notion of going to social media, where once you have a system on social media, we sort of dispense with professional editors and producers and that, and we all decide what our friends see. And that's become a huge problem, because then you have these media companies, like you say, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, that are not invested in trying to get accurate information to share. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get engaging information to share. And what's engaging? Well, these machine learning algorithms that they're running and everything else are discovering that what's engaging is stuff that's shocking, scandalous, surprising, not accurate. And so they've created this entire information ecosystem that's all predicated on engagement rather than accuracy. And that's a major fundamental problem. And it's why, a big component of dealing with all of this is bringing media literacy into the whole story.
Absolutely, information literacy. So we have to have the confidence, and I want to lean on your perspective as a scientist and biologist again here, in the drug makers and the scientists who are investigating vaccines and therapeutics for the pandemic, that it's not going to be the way it is for the social media companies. In other words, accuracy is going to take precedent over engagement. Do you have confidence in the current academic and corporate pharmaceutical ecosystem that this is going to be done?
I think that there's always room for improvement. I think that overall the incentive. I mean, I think about incentives and the way incentive structures are lined up, and in the pharmaceutical ecosystem, as we're thinking about, say, vaccine development, no one can afford a mistake here. And I'm really worried about countries like China and Russia that may be rushing into deploying vaccines that haven't been properly tested. Here in the United States, if we go forward with a vaccine that turns out not to work, and causes negative side effects and things like that, that's going to really harm people's trust in the vaccine system more broadly. We could end up not only losing the battle with COVID, but we could lose a bunch of the previously vaccine presentable diseases as well, as people become more and more skeptical of the value and safety of vaccines. So I think everyone is acutely aware of this, and so barring some kind of very unfortunate political pressure that gets mounted with respect to the election timing and so forth, I don't think that there is going to be a rush to bring an unsafe vaccine onto the market here in the United States, because everyone is so acutely aware of that particular issue.
What are the kinds of not so innocuous BS that would manipulate the vaccine results? In other words, it's not impossible that if a vaccine, what I like to call a show vaccine for our show president, that if he poached, the rotten apples from companies that were prepared to, do it ethically, but if basically he the drug administration said we're going to do this in the most unsavory way possible. What are the ways that unscrupulous scientists could try to gin this up to satisfy his desire for a show vaccine?
I think it would mostly involve taking the data from phase 3 trials, early data from phase 3 trials, and spinning stories around those data, exactly manipulating those data so that, not necessarily faking the data, but, making claims based on those data, doing unsavory statistics, that kinds of things, to claim that the safety profile of the vaccine is better understood than it is, and possibly the efficacy is better understood than it is. Now, on the positive side, I do think that there are very few academic scientists who are unsavory like this. There does seem to be this, suspicion that, all the public health scientists are on the take from pharma or something like that. And while certainly pharma does have a reach, into prescribing behavior and all of these other things, I think there are very, very few people, even the ones that I think are making terrible mistakes, who are doing this for the money. People are doing this because they believe in the results that they're finding. So when we see some of the big controversies that are going on around the science of COVID right now, there are people that are accused of monetizing essentially.
So what are tactics that might be employed that are not intentionally malicious, but that could lead to not an effective result, but by using maybe a sample size that's not comprehensive enough, or by just not doing enough due diligence with respect to the third stage of a vaccine trial?
Yeah, luckily the sort of procedures for doing a phase 3 trial are fairly well worked out. I mean, I think that one of the main tactics that you might see if people try to push things through in sort of a show manner would be to make arguments about the relative importance of acting quickly versus safety, and so arguments about continuing to collect data as things go forward. Maybe we, instead of running a full phase, I mean, we had this proposal. There's a proposal in Forbes from Steven Salzberg that he then backed off because he changed his mind about it, which I think was a very admirable thing to do. Where he said maybe instead of running a full phase 3 trial, we can start to do a sort of compassionate use rollout of vaccines that seem to be working now. And he was extremely well intentioned in doing this and had thought through it carefully, and then talked to his colleagues extensively after this came out, and then reversed it and published a nice reversal after that. But I think that would be the sort of thing that we'd see. We'd see this vaccine rolled out under the sort of grounds of, well, we've got to do something right away, and it's really important that it's saving lives, and chances are it's going to be fine, because that's really been the approach that this administration has taken to the pandemic all along. Let's hope for the best and act accordingly, right? And I could see that sort of behavior with the vaccine too. They keep thinking, we're going to get lucky with this. It's not going to happen on our watch, and they keep not getting lucky, and right. I can see the same mistake being made again.
And it's hard to call BS or malarkey on 160,000 American souls gone.
Right.
It's hard to make a persuasive case for yourself to excuse that, right? I mean, I'm wondering if the threshold for sort of tolerable or allowable malarkey or BS is, it's 160,000 dead Americans and the most irresponsible, reckless response to a pandemic in history is pretty above the threshold.
That's certainly my view. I mean, I think there are a lot of different efforts to try to divert and diffuse blame. I mean, on one side you do these unreasonable, not really fair comparisons, and you say, well, that's actually fewer than who are dying of heart disease, so who cares? Or then another, and then ignoring the fact that these are excess deaths, and right. We've radically changed society to prevent it from being an even larger number. But then the other sort of thing that we see is maybe attempts to say, well, it's not really the administration's fault because hydrochloroquine works and the doctors wouldn't let us use it. So we see all of these attempts, and people are just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. But that's one I've seen lately, is that I think some of the pressure for hydrochloroquine may have less to do with trying to get rid of the purchased doses as to find an excuse for this 160,000 deaths that doesn't involve absolute incompetence in the White House.
Do you think any of that was motivated by the idea that if you took that drug, if everybody were to take that drug, we might have a greater immunity? I mean, more of us would have immunity. Because
we would have been exposed to the disease and had swept through to herd immunity, or that the drug itself would be protective.
Right. That it is for the same reason that folks had advocated or espoused reintroducing the polio vaccine, that that drug taken as a protective measure, or taking the old polio vaccine would have ginned up enough antibodies or protection. I mean, because there were some scientists, and still some, who talk about that as working for certain patients.
Right. Some people do. I mean, I think the people who are advocating, many of the scientists who are advocating for that drug firmly believe that it will work. And I think that is the motivation for most of the scientists that are promoting it. My sense is that we keep getting negative result after negative result after negative result in the properly run clinical trials. The ones that come through positive are these small, poorly designed trials, and you're seeing this publication bias issue. Whereas if I run a small, poorly designed trial and it doesn't work, then that just ends up in my desk drawer. Run a small, poorly designed trial and it does work, then I can publish that.
Was the proposition that was it only, and is it still only being advocated as a treatment or as a proactive regimen that one could take?
Both. I mean, people have tried all sorts of things, right? People are thinking of it as prophylaxis. They're thinking of it, people have explored it for pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis. People are looking at it for late-stage disease. I mean, so people are trying a bunch of different things, and the next sort of frontier is to try it in combinations with various other drugs. None of these things seem to be working adequately.
Final question for you, Professor.
Of course.
Human challenge trials. Are you an advocate of them? I know you just alluded to one of your colleagues'
Stephen
comment.
Salter. Yeah.
Right. But is there a point at which that is ethical to do?
It's a very difficult question. I don't have a strong position on that. I think that it's a discussion that's worth having. I don't have the background in medical ethics to have firmly decided that this is right or wrong. What is interesting to me, obviously you have to be very careful about the populations on whom you run these human challenge trials. So you don't want them to be, you don't want it to be people who are now suddenly out of work and are forced with the decision of feeding their kids and so on. But what's very interesting is the number of medical students who volunteered for these human challenge trials is enormous. You could run the trials exclusively on people who have other options and are simply doing this because they believe that they're relatively low risk and they have that desire to help humanity. So because of that, I think it's a conversation worth having. If we didn't have those people and it was just, forcing people into it by financial insecurity, then I would be completely opposed.
And if you're safely guarding it and making sure.
I mean, it has to be safely guarded. You have to give people the proper standards of care and all of that, but yeah.
University of Washington biologist Carl Bergstrom, author of a new book on malarkey, which is Calling BS, Calling Bullshit, that might have just been bleeped. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. Thanks. Take care.
Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, Lawrence B. Benenson, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.